Welcome everyone to our webinar today that will cover the topic of merger and acquisitions, getting your IT integration strategy right post-acquisition. I am Chloe Pott and I will be your moderator today. Today we are joined by Mark Boja. Mark is part of our solution consulting group here at Nexthink. Mark Boja has been working at Nexthink for more than 4 years, assisting customers understanding how to solve their complex business and IT challenges with their unique perspective that Nexthink provides. Prior to Nexthink, Mark worked at several software companies, including ServiceNow, BMC, Symantec. Mark holds an MBA from the Open University in the UK. Thanks for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you very much, Chloe, and welcome everybody. To set the scene for the rest of this webinar, what I'd like to do is just give you a brief overview of the agenda and the topics that we're going to be covering off. We're going to kick it off really by understanding the business context in terms of what's going on in the M&A world at the moment, and specifically what we're seeing with our customers. What we're then going to do is consider in outline how Nexthink solves some of the key challenges associated with M&A before moving into some specific examples in terms of concrete use cases. Then we can do some Q&A at the end. So if we look at the business context, what we've seen is that merger and acquisition activity is more popular than ever. You can see this in the graph here that really shows this blip in the last 4 years, where there's really been an unprecedented growth in terms of both the number of transactions from an M&A standpoint, but also the value of those transactions. So really what this means, I think, for a lot of people on this webinar is that the likelihood of you being involved or either having to manage the integration or a divestiture of an IT organization is just that much higher. So the other aspect of this increase in frequency is that we're also witnessing this in our own customer base as well. This is a quote from one of our customers who we can't name, but the principle is that they were looking to use Nexthink to assist them with the divestiture of some of their particular business units. And they saw that the insight and analytics and everything else that's offered by Nexthink really provided them with the opportunity. And we're seeing this in multiple sectors. We're seeing this in the technology sector, in manufacturing, in logistics, and it's increasingly a relevant use case for our Nexthink customers. But I think anybody that's got close to the topic of mergers and acquisitions probably has read a statistic like this that suggests that the failure rate of M&A is incredibly high. This is from a 2016 quote from Harvard Business Review, and it suggests that the figure, somewhere in the 70 to 90% range. And there's a lot of reasons why M&A fails. Typically, this is due to poor due diligence, I should say. But what does that really mean? Typically, that means that people made assumptions about how they were going to execute going forward. And there was a kind of a poverty of information or a poverty of visibility that basically meant that they didn't have the correct insights in order to execute well. So what we're going to be exploring in this webinar are what are those key decisions that people make when it comes to IT integration? What are the kinds of information that people need to have? And specifically how Nexthink supports you in that increased decision-making capability. And this is really, really important because what we're seeing is that IT failure or IT integration failure is actually one of the top reasons why M&A fails. And there's lots of examples. We see this typically in banking, where two banks merge, they try to integrate their customer relationship management systems, they fail, the customers show discontent, they move their accounts somewhere else, and there's even quoted losses of about 150 million as customers decided that they'd rather go and bank somewhere else. So there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of challenge associated with this whole M&A, and particularly IT integration. So how does Nexthink help? Really, when we talk to our customers about what they're trying to achieve and how Nexthink helps, what we see is that the kind of problem breaks down into two specific areas. The first one we will, I guess, call assess, which is the ability of an organization to correctly assess what it is that they've purchased or what it is that they're about to sell, and also the ability to transform well. So in other words, whatever the combined IT organization ends up being, how do they actually transition? What's the journey they go on, and how do they go about doing that? If we look at that first challenge around assessment, what we see is that this is much more than just an asset inventory exercise. You need to understand how the people, the processes work, what services have they got, and also what is the underlying IT infrastructure that's in place, and what are the touch points on that IT infrastructure, and what else is also sharing that IT infrastructure. So often people talk about the word disambiguation, which is a fancy way of saying break something down into its constituent parts. And this is really what we see as the challenge. It is the disambiguation challenge. The other part of the polymer transformation piece is how do we get to synergies? How do we make sure that the combined organization is more than the sum of the two parts? How do you leverage good capabilities and competencies from both organizations to actually generate something that when joined together actually generates more value? And again, the challenge there is really about measurement, and it's really all about making smart decisions. Okay, so how does Nexthink help, and what does Nexthink actually do? So this is a brief explanation of really what Nexthink does. Underneath Nexthink is a powerful analytics platform, and what that platform does is it collects in real time all of the user experiences that are going on. So in other words, it collects and monitors data about the overall consumption of IT in real time. It monitors every user, every device, everything that they're consuming, and presents that information in a digestible form that lets you get insights around what's going on in your organization. What we can also do is we can then take that platform, that insight, that knowledge, and leverage that with other modules. For example, to solicit feedback from customers with our Engage module, to act and remediate, to integrate with different cloud platforms. And really what this lets you do is to really manage what people are increasingly calling the sort of digital experience. But let's focus a little bit around a number of selected use cases that we thought about specifically for M&A. This by no means is an exhaustive list of Nexthink use cases. In fact, there are probably hundreds and thousands of different use cases for Nexthink. But what we decided to do was to choose three that we thought were probably relevant. And what we're going to get into is the kind of decisions that need to be made, the kind of information that's needed to support those decisions. And we're going to show you some screenshots and some ideas around the product, so you can see what it would really look and sort of feel like. But let's sort of explore these use cases in some detail. The first one we're going to talk about is business application assessment. So in other words, it's really understanding the behavior of an application, not just from the perspective of who's using it or how often they're using it, but also what are the touch points in the infrastructure that application is using, because it may be relevant for us to divest that application, or maybe we want to absorb that application and we need to understand what are the constituent parts that are actually being accessed, what are the components that are actually being used, so that we can form an appropriate assessment. Also, what's important there is what other applications and services happen to be also sharing the infrastructure that application is using. So the ability, as it were, to see, as we discussed earlier, all of the moving parts so that we can do that. And we'll talk a little bit about how we do that. One of the other use cases that we wanted to focus on was, how do you generate a combined IT organization that's actually more than the sum of the two parts? In other words, what is the combined desktop hardware and operating system strategy? How are we getting the best of both worlds when we're joining our IT organizations together? And what data do we have that help support those decisions? And then the other one we're going to be talking about is, how do we accelerate application consolidation? Because one of the areas that we find a lot of people find themselves in is really deduplicating their software portfolio. And that's more than just sort of tracking what's being used and who's using it and where the overlaps are, but it's actually engaging with the end users to appreciate how we can actually execute on those plans and really make them move much more quickly. So let's dig in. Let's take a look at this first use case, which is application assessment. So this actually is a Nexthink view. This is how we visualize the behavior of an application with Nexthink. It doesn't really matter what this business application is, because Nexthink automatically collects this data for all applications all of the time. And what we're looking at is the behavior of a business application that on the left-hand side we can see has got a number of devices. There's about 19 devices are consuming this application. We have about the similar number of users. We've got one binary that's been executing. We can see it's consuming a number of ports, and it's also connecting through to a number of destinations. So what this is actually showing us is the entire end-to-end chain of how this application is behaving. We not only know who's using it, where they're using it, but we also understand what that application is consuming in terms of infrastructure components. We know how much data is going across, and if we were to desire to do so, it's very easy for us to really just drill down, for example, go to a quick list of users. So we know straight away who's consuming that application, we know the destination servers, and we can further categorize that information as well. So for example, we could break down that application by business unit. So we could understand, which business units, which parts, which locations, which parts of our business are actually taking advantage of that application. And by itself, this would be very useful information for us to understand how do we divest, how do we merge, how do we absorb this particular piece of software and all of its constituent parts. But the wonderful thing about Nexthink is it's very easy for us to go backwards and forwards in the data. If you could imagine, on the right-hand side, we know that we've got destination servers that are being consumed by this application. What would be nice is to understand, well, we know we've got 19 users of this particular application using these 3 servers. Who else is also using those servers? So for us, that's a very simple query to do. We simply query the Nexthink database in real time, and we can then present back all of the devices and users that are also using one of those servers. And straight away, we actually realize that we're in a much more complicated situation than we walked into. So what we've done here is we've literally moved backwards from the data. We've seen one of the destinations that's been accessed by that business application, and we've quickly queried the database, turned it on its head and said, now present back to me everybody else, not just this business application, but everybody else. And for us, it's a very simple drill down to simply present the applications that are being consumed against this server. So really what this gives us is a complete end-to-end view, backwards and forwards through all of the infrastructure. And if you can imagine, this is a whole data lake of information that we've got, and we can drill in, we can drill down, we can re-query the database, we can go backwards, we can go forwards, and really understand all of the moving parts. So now, armed with this additional information, we might conclude actually that there's quite a level of complexity. This task of divesting this application or absorbing this application is that much more difficult, because we have all of these additional infrastructure and application dependencies that we wouldn't have otherwise known. And it's Nexthink's unique ability to capture all the applications and all the connections they're making that really lets us achieve this. And this really solves that whole disambiguation problem. How do we break down our IT into its constituent components, and how do we understand who's using what, where are they using it, what's the infrastructure that's involved, and also what are the other applications and services and users and devices that also happen to be sharing that infrastructure. So we see that as a very powerful use case for Nexthink, particularly in these M&A situations. So let's take a look at another bit of detail around the use case. And this one is really about creating a combined desktop hardware and an operating system strategy. I think in a lot of M&A situations, people typically want to be able to generate synergy by combining the best from both organizations. The challenge with that is it's very difficult to have a benchmark for quality and a benchmark for what good looks like. So what we're presenting in this dashboard here is exactly that. we're seeing a definition of Nexthink and what we think our IT from our hardware and operating system strategy looks like. And then we've got this notional organization, organization X. And straight away we can see that ours is showing green and theirs is showing amber. And there's a score. One is 8.48 and one is 7.56. So this is a individually calibrated and baseline score that we've built out based on combining a number of different metrics from within Nexthink. In fact, metrics are supported for about 700 different pieces of information with Nexthink. And what we're able to do is to draw them all together into this dashboard. So if we look at the Nexthink organization showing here, we've got fairly basic static sort of asset data, which is around the number of devices, and we've got a view around the distribution from a manufacturer standpoint. We've also got the same for operating systems. But where the distinction with Nexthink is that we've actually calibrated scores, as we call them, for specific areas. In other words, we developed a score for the manufacturer, a score for the operating system, and a score for the device type itself on a scale of 0 to 10. And in fact, these top level numbers, the 8.48, are essentially a combination of those scores, as it were, rolled up and weighted and had various things done to them. But what we've been doing here is that we've been using a blend of different metrics. So for example, for operating system, we may look at things like how many times does the device blue screen, how many times does we have an application crash or an application freeze. For the manufacturer vendor score, we could be looking, for example, at what is the smart index on the hard drive. Is the hardware about to fail? But we can mask all of that complexity and present that in this meaningful dashboard that we're actually showing here. But what we're able to do really is start to compare and contrast based on a common understanding of what good looks like. And what's interesting in this particular graph is that we can see that we've got some red showing for organization X on Windows 10. That actually shows that perhaps their operating system, Windows 10, whilst it might be innovating, is probably less stable than our overall platform is, and that's probably why there's a difference in that particular score. So that's something to investigate. But the principle is that we can present all of our data in this meaningful way. We can also calibrate how that information is presented. And I think the third thing that's very interesting is that this is not just static asset data about the device and how big or small or what we've purchased. This is actually telling us operational performance data around the actual device itself and what that user is experiencing. So they've had crashes, they've had connection failures, and this sort of operational data is typically not what you'd capture in your inventory system, for example. So a very good way of getting to what good looks like, a very good way of combining information, comparing and contrasting, and then being able to make smart decisions about what the combined IT strategy needs to look like. So let's take a look at our final use case. And in our final use case, what we're looking at here is a typical application consolidation situation. Often we find that organizations are looking to deduplicate their software. They've got a combined IT organization. Typically, a particular category of software may be present, as it is in this instance, which would be conferencing software, but typically there are duplicates, meaning they've got different products doing the same thing. And in this scenario here, what we've got is a situation where there are the go-forward strategy, let's say, is Skype for Business, and we have 985 users of Skype for Business shown in the top left-hand side. But what we've also got is this legacy application from the acquired company, which has still got 334 users. What we're able to do is to track the consumption in real time of both those applications and present it on this dashboard here. The peaks and the troughs are the weekends, and we can see the consumption over the course of the days. What we're also able to do directly in this dashboard as well is to calibrate what that would mean for us in terms of business outcome. So in other words, we estimate that if we were to convert those 334 users of GoToMeeting to Skype for Business, that would net around about 44K of value back to the organization. So good information, good insight, good technical data. The challenge typically, though, is to understand why those particular users still continue to use a legacy application post-merger. And it's very difficult, to understand when they're doing this, why they're doing that. So with Nexthink, what we can do is we can garner not just quantitative data, but we can also garner qualitative data from the end users themselves in context. So down to the bottom right-hand side there, you can actually see a pop-up screen. And that pop-up screen starts to engage the user saying, you know that you can use Skype for Business, don't you? And they go, well, show me. And then it asks a whole series of additional questions around, the level of awareness. Do they see any technical issues? The principle is though that we can actually invoke that dialogue in context. Because it's all in real time, what we can do is the moment they fire up GoToMeeting, that dialogue box can appear in real time and prompt them as to why they're doing that. We find that because we tend to present this information in context at the right moment, that the response rates are very, very high. What we're then able to do is to gather that information and present it in the same dashboard. So towards the bottom half of the dashboard, what you can actually see are all of the reasons, all of the responses to the survey. And we can see that the vast majority of respondents actually said, well, I've got no idea what Skype for Business is. What is it? Yes, there were some people sort of presenting some technical issues and we could drill down to those. But the reason why this application is still being in use is that there was an awareness issue and a communications issue. And because we've got this data, because we have high levels of response rates, we're now able to make an intervention. And really what this means is that you can accelerate your application consolidation efforts. And this is really one of the major benefit areas around going through an acquisition, is to rationalize the portfolio of software that's available. But not just do that from a sort of a position of tracking the data, but also doing things like getting users' consent, bringing the users with you, engaging them directly with that particular discussion. So again, a very relevant case study for how we can assist you in a mergers and acquisitions situation. So what I'd like to do is just summarize. So Nexthink really is supporting enterprise clients with their current M&A initiatives. What we're finding is they're benefiting from the improved insight that's provided by Nexthink, and they're making smarter decisions, and therefore their M&A activity is really much more successful. Amongst other use cases, and we've just explored three very simple ones here, the ones that we've seen here, really, we've talked about that whole issue around application assessment. And I think what you've been able to see there is that there's a lot of data that's provided by Nexthink. That data really presents the whole application behavior of all applications in real time. That data is very transactional. We can delve into it, go backwards and forwards through the data and really figure out where all the moving parts are. And that means that you can build optimal transformation plans, and we're seeing some customers get sort of 20% benefit in terms of reduced time to do those sort of things. What we're also seeing as well is that we can get operational data regarding the active consumption, the user experience of their current environments that they're consuming. Therefore, when you're combining organizations, it's very easy for us to present a compare and contrast situation, so that when you decide on what the combined strategy is, you're doing that from a position of strength and understanding and real data. That means that you're not making guesses, you're not making assumptions, but you're also getting to the synergies that you're hoping for in the acquisitions, in terms of getting the best of both worlds when you're going through those. And finally, what we've seen here is that really when you're looking to rationalize a software portfolio in an M&A situation, the challenge typically is not the technical data around tracking who's using what, but it's really about engaging with those end users, soliciting sentiment and feedback and qualitative data, so that you can drive real action plans that actually do make a difference. So with that, I'd like to hand you back to Chloe, and we can get into some Q&A.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Let's jump straight into the Q&A and see what questions that have come in so far. Here's the first one. So I have an asset inventory product. Can't I do all that you've presented just today with that product, or how is Nexthink any different?
Thanks, Clay. That's a really good question. So really what we see is that an asset inventory product is very good at telling you what it is that you've purchased. but traditionally they're not used to gather operational data regarding the user experience and the consumption of IT. A good example would be telling you where people are failing to connect to a particular resource, for example. Because Nexthink gathers up all of that operational real-time data, we're able to give you a real view about the experience of the end user. And because that information is so important, as we've seen with that assessment piece and as we've seen with those transformation use cases, it's really the only way that you can realistically go about approaching a problem like that. The technologies are different. Fundamentally, you've got a tool that will tell you what you've purchased, and you've got a solution that will actually tell you how users are actually interacting and consuming IT.
Okay, thank you.
Good question.
Here's the second one that's come in. How are you actually able to see all of this activity that's going on?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because at the moment I think it sort of presents as very interesting bits of information and data and visualizations, but under the hood, what's really going on. So I think that the thing about Nexthink that's quite sort of unique is that we're not a classic sort of discovery technology where there's some kind of agent that discovers and then stores and forwards data. The way that Nexthink works is that we've got we call it kind of a kernel level driver that sits really under the hood, under the operating system, and sits there passively streaming data in real time up to a central location. And because it's working in that way, A, we're at a much lower level, so it can capture all of the data that you've seen and that we've presented. B, it does that in a very, very lightweight way, because it's just a trickle of information going up. And of course, the third benefit is you get all that data in real time. And that real-time view is often very useful to understand right now who's doing what and where they're connecting to, and is there a problem.
All right. It looks like those seem to be the only questions that have come in so far. We'll leave a few more seconds for those who might be shy to see if they want to submit any more questions to Mark. In the meantime, I want to thanks to everyone who has joined us today for the webinar. If you have any further questions that we have not addressed today during the webinar, you can please visit our website on the screen at nexthink.com. Or if you have any questions you'd like to send directly to Mark, he has made himself available at mark.boja@nexthink.com. And thanks again for everyone. And thank you, Mark, for speaking today. And everyone will receive a link to the recording to the webinar later on this evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.